pressure chamber catastrophe. The Byford Dolphin was a semi-submersible drilling rig operating in the North Sea, roughly 200 miles off the coast of Norway. On November 5th, 1983, 5 men died aboard that rig in one of the most violent decompression events ever recorded in the history of commercial diving. Saturation diving is one of the most demanding forms of underwater work ever developed. Divers who work at extreme depths cannot simply return to the surface when their shift ends. The pressure difference between the ocean floor and the surface is too great. A rapid ascent would kill them. Instead, saturation divers live inside pressurized chambers aboard the rig for days at a time, breathing a specialized gas mixture and existing at the same atmospheric pressure as the depth at which they work. Their bodies slowly equilibrate to that pressure. When a job is complete, they decompress gradually, over the course of days, following strict protocols designed to prevent their blood and tissues from forming bubbles. The Byford Dolphin's saturation system consisted of a series of interconnected chambers and a diving bell. The bell was used to transport divers from the pressurized living quarters down to the worksite on the seabed and back again. When the bell returned to the rig, it connected to the saturation chamber system through a pressurized trunk. That connection had to be sealed and secure before any part of the system could be opened. On the afternoon of November 5th, 4 divers were inside the saturation chambers. The system was pressurized to approximately 9 atmospheres, roughly 132 pounds per square inch, reflecting the depth at which the divers had been working. A diving tender, whose role was to assist with the bell connection, was positioned at the external clamp that secured the bell to the system. The day had followed normal operational patterns. The bell had returned from a dive. The docking procedure was underway. The tender was working at the connection point, moving through what should have been a standard sequence of steps. The clamp securing the bell to the pressurized trunk was operated manually. It was an external mechanism. Critically, it lacked an automatic interlock, a device that would prevent it from being opened, while the system behind it remained under pressure. Without that interlock, the only safeguard between the pressurized interior and the open atmosphere was the attention and procedure compliance of the person operating the clamp. The clamp was opened while the system was still at 9 atmospheres. The pressure differential between the interior of the saturation system and the outside air was released instantaneously. 9 atmospheres of pressure sought equilibrium in a fraction of a second. The result was an explosive decompression of a severity that investigators would later describe as extreme even by the standards of industrial accidents. The force of the decompression was catastrophic. The diving bell and chamber components were violently displaced. The trunk connecting the bell to the living quarters became the path through which 9 atmospheres of compressed gas escaped at once. 3 of the divers inside the saturation chambers died instantly, while the 4th was torn apart by the escaping air. One of the tenders positioned at the external clamp also died. Investigators from Norway's Petroleum Directorate examined the wreckage and the operational records in detail. Their findings identified the absence of an automatic pressure interlock on the clamp mechanism as the central failure point. The clamp could be opened manually, regardless of the pressure state of the system it was connected to. No mechanical safeguard existed to prevent that action. The investigation further found that the design of the system placed full reliance on procedural compliance rather than engineered prevention. When that procedural layer failed, there was nothing else. Emergency response aboard the rig was immediate, but had nothing to reverse. The decompression event had concluded in an instant. What responders found was the aftermath of a pressure release that had already run its course. The victims were beyond any form of medical intervention. Authorities confirmed the deaths of all 5 men. The cause was explosive decompression, resulting from the pressurized saturation system being opened to the atmosphere through an uninterlocked external clamp mechanism. In the years following the Byford Dolphin disaster, automatic pressure interlocks became a mandatory feature of saturation diving systems globally. The interlock that did not exist on November 5, 1983, became a required engineering standard across the industry. 5 men died. The clamp that killed them had no mechanism to stop it from being opened. Bhopal's poisoned night. Bhopal is a city in the state of Madhya Pradesh in central India. In 1984, it was home to a plant operated by Union Carbide India Limited, a subsidiary of the American corporation Union Carbide. The plant produced pesticides. One of the chemicals it used and stored was methyl isocyanate, a highly toxic compound used in the manufacture of certain pesticides. Methyl isocyanate, commonly referred to as MIC, is extraordinarily reactive. Contact with water causes a rapid and violent exothermic reaction. Exposure to the gas it produces causes severe damage to the lungs, eyes, and tissues of the body. The plant had been built in the 1970s, positioned near the northern edge of Bhopal's urban area. In the years that followed its construction, the surrounding land filled with residential neighborhoods. By 1984, hundreds of thousands thousands of people lived in close proximity to the facility. Many of the densest settlements were directly adjacent to the plant's perimeter. By late 1984, the Bhopal plant had reduced its operations significantly. Pesticide demand had declined, and several of the plant's safety systems had fallen into disrepair or been taken offline. The refrigeration unit designed to keep the MX storage tanks cool had been shut down. Pressure gauges on the tanks were known to be unreliable. A scrubber system intended to neutralize any accidental MIC release had been taken out of service for maintenance. A flare tower designed to burn off escaping gases was also not operational. Tank 610 held a substantial quantity of liquid MIC. On the night of December 2, 1984, water entered Tank 610. The precise pathway through which the water entered the tank has been the subject of dispute, but investigations confirmed that an isolation blank, a physical barrier that should have been in place to prevent water from entering the MIC line during pipe washing operations, was absent. Water and MIC combined inside the sealed tank. The reaction that followed generated intense heat and pressure. The temperature inside tank 610 rose rapidly. The pressure inside the tank climbed beyond the capacity of the safety valve to contain. Shortly after midnight on December 3rd, the tank vented. Methyl isocyanate gas began releasing from the tank in massive quantities. The gas is denser than air. It did not rise and disperse. It settled low to the ground and moved outward from the plant in a dense ground-hugging cloud, carried by the light wind. It moved toward the residential neighborhoods to the south and southeast of the plant. The people living in those neighborhoods were asleep. There were no sirens. There was no public warning system activated by the plant. Residents woke to the gas without warning, many of them unable to see, unable to breathe, with no understanding of what was happening to them. People poured into the streets. Many collapsed in those streets. Animals died where they stood. The cloud continued to move. Hospitals in Bhopal were overwhelmed within hours. The medical staff who received patients had no information about what chemical had been released, and no established treatment protocol for mass MIC exposure. The scale of the casualties arriving at emergency facilities throughout the night exceeded anything the city's medical infrastructure had capacity to handle. The gas cloud affected an area of approximately 25 square miles. Thousands of people died in the immediate hours following the release. Thousands more died in the days and weeks that followed. Estimates of the immediate death toll vary, but thousands of confirmed fatalities were recorded in the period directly following the disaster. Long-term casualties from chronic illness linked to the exposure continued to accumulate for years and decades afterward, with some estimates placing the total death count in the tens of thousands when accounting for those who died from related conditions in the years that followed. The Indian government and Union Carbide became subjects of civil and criminal legal proceedings that continued for years. The plant site in Bhopal remained contaminated. More than 3,800 people were officially pronounced dead in the immediate aftermath of the release. The cause was exposure to methyl isocyanate gas released from tank 610 following a chemical reaction with water that entered through a line missing its isolation blank. The Bhopal gas disaster is recorded as the deadliest industrial accident in history. Locked doors, no exit. 23 Washington Place in Manhattan's Greenwich Village was a 10-story building. In 1911, the top 3 floors were occupied by the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, one of the largest garment manufacturers in New York City. On March 25th of that year, 146 workers died there. Most of them were young women. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company employed approximately 500 workers at peak operation. The workforce was made up largely of recent immigrant women, many of them Italian and Eastern European, most of them in their teens and 20s. They came to work 6 days a week, operating sewing machines in rows across the factory floors, producing the shirtwaists, a style of women's blouse that the company sold throughout the country. The conditions on the factory floors were typical of the garment industry of the era. The sewing tables were arranged in tight rows. Fabric scraps and cuttings accumulated beneath the machines and in bins throughout the work areas. The floors were wooden. Oil from the machines soaked into the surfaces and collected in the spaces between tables. The building had stairwells and a freight elevator. There was also a fire escape on the exterior of the building. The factory's management had instituted a policy of keeping stairwell doors locked during working hours. The stated reason was to prevent theft and to control the movement of workers. The doors were locked from the outside. Workers inside the factory could not open them. On the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, a Saturday, the workday was nearing its end. Several hundred workers were still at their machines or preparing to leave. A fire broke out on the 8th floor, likely ignited by a discarded cigarette or a lit match near a bin of fabric scraps. The exact ignition point was never conclusively determined. The fire spread quickly through the cutting tables. The accumulated fabric scraps acted as fuel. Within minutes, the 8th floor was engulfed. Workers on the 8th floor rushed toward the exits. Some reached the freight elevator. Some reached the Green Street stairwell, which was accessible, and made it down. Others reached the Washington Place stairwell and found the door locked. Workers on the 9th floor had less warning. The fire moved upward. By the time many of them were aware of its scale, the stairwells were already compromised. The Washington Place door on the 9th floor was also locked. Workers moved to the windows. The fire department arrived and raised their ladders. The ladders did not reach the 8th floor. The equipment of the era was not designed to access the upper stories of a 10-story building. Firefighters on the street watched from below. Some workers waited at the windows as long as they could. Others did not wait. The fire lasted approximately 18 minutes. In that time, 146 people died. Many were found at the locked doors. Many were found in the stairwells. Others died in the street below. Investigators documented the locked doors. The factory's owners, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were indicted on manslaughter charges. The prosecution argued that the locked doors were the direct cause of the inability to escape. Harris and Blank were acquitted in December of 1911. A civil suit brought on behalf of 23 victims' families resulted in a settlement. The owners collected insurance payments that exceeded the settlement amounts they paid out. The Triangle Fire prompted an immediate legislative response. New York State enacted sweeping new fire safety and labor laws in the years that followed, including requirements for unlocked fire exits, automatic sprinkler systems in certain buildings, and limits on working hours. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union grew substantially in the aftermath. 146 workers were pronounced dead. The cause was smoke inhalation, burns, and traumatic injuries. The stairwell doors were locked, Silica in the dark. Gauley Bridge, West Virginia sits at the confluence of the Gauley and New Rivers in a region of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1930, construction began on a tunnel through Hawks Nest Mountain, a project commissioned to divert water from the New River to a hydroelectric generating facility several miles away. The project was contracted by Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation. The men hired to drill that tunnel were, in large part, impoverished black laborers recruited from the Deep South. The year was 1930. The Great Depression had begun. Work was scarce. Men traveled to Gauley Bridge because work was being offered, and because they had few alternatives. Many arrived with families. They were housed in company shacks near the worksite. They were paid low wages. They were given their tools and sent underground. The geology of Hawks Nest Mountain was not an ordinary mix of rock. The silica content of the rock being drilled was nearly pure, with some estimates placing it above 99%. Silica, when drilled and disturbed, produces fine particulate dust. When that dust is inhaled, it lodges in the lung tissue. In concentrations high enough and over exposure periods long enough, it causes silicosis, a progressive and fatal scarring of the lungs. The tunnel was drilled dry. Wet drilling, which suppresses dust by applying water at the drill point, was understood at the time to reduce silica exposure. The contractors did not use it, at least not consistently. Ventilation in the tunnel was minimal. The fine white dust generated by drilling through nearly pure silica filled the tunnels, and the air the men breathed every day of every shift. Workers began falling ill. The progression of acute silicosis in conditions of very high silica exposure can be rapid. Men who had been working in the tunnel for months developed severe respiratory symptoms. Some died within a year of beginning work. The company was aware of the conditions inside the tunnel. Efforts were made to conceal the scale of what was happening. Some workers who died were buried in a field near the worksite. Families were reportedly told that men had died of pneumonia or other causes. The company controlled the surrounding environment in ways that limited outside scrutiny. Workers continued drilling. The tunnel was completed in 1932. In the years that followed, the death toll became increasingly difficult to suppress. Journalists and attorneys began investigating. Congressional hearings were held in 1936. Survivors and family members testified. The testimony described the conditions inside the tunnel, the dust, the lack of protective equipment, the speed at which men had become sick, and the company's management of the situation. The death toll has never been definitively confirmed. Official records from the time were incomplete, reflecting in part the deliberate concealment efforts and in part the broader indifference to documenting the deaths of black laborers in 1930s America. Estimates from historians and researchers range from several hundred to more than 700 deaths, directly attributable to silicosis contracted in the Hawks Nest Tunnel. No criminal prosecution resulted from the congressional hearings or the investigations that followed. Civil suits were filed, some settlements were paid. The surviving workers and their families received limited compensation relative to the scale of the harm. Hundreds of men are confirmed dead. The cause was acute silicosis, resulting from unventilated, unprotected drilling through nearly pure silica rock. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster is considered one of the most extensively concealed industrial mass deaths in American history. Green concrete, fatal fall. Willow Island is a small community along the Ohio River in Pleasants County, West Virginia. In the mid-1970s, construction began on the Pleasance Power Station, a coal-fired electrical generating facility. Part of that construction involved building large cooling towers, the tall, tapered concrete structures used to dissipate heat from the plant's generating systems. On April 27, 1978, the construction of one of those towers killed 51 men in a single event. Cooling towers of the type being built at Pleasance are constructed using a method called slip forming. A ring of scaffolding and formwork travels slowly upward as the concrete structure beneath it hardens, with workers riding the scaffolding as it rises. The scaffolding is anchored to the concrete wall of the tower as it climbs. The entire system depends on one foundational requirement. The concrete into which the scaffold anchors are set must be strong enough to bear the load. Concrete does not reach full strength immediately after it is poured. The curing process takes time, and the rate at which concrete gains strength depends on temperature, humidity, and the specific mix used. Concrete that has not yet cured to an adequate strength is referred to in the construction industry as green concrete. Green concrete can fail under loads that hardened concrete would support without difficulty. On the morning of April 27th, the crew working on the cooling tower arrived at the site and prepared to begin the day's work. 51 men were on or near the scaffolding when operations began. The scaffolding system was loaded and in use. The anchors holding the scaffolding to the tower wall were set in concrete that had not cured to adequate strength. The first anchor failed. When it pulled free from the green concrete, it transferred additional load to the anchors adjacent to it. Those anchors failed as well. The failure propagated around the ring of the tower in sequence, each anchor giving way as the load redistributed. The scaffolding, with the men on it, separated from the tower wall. 51 men fell. The distance from the working level to the base of the tower was substantial. Emergency services were called to the Pleasance Power Station site. Responders arriving at the base of the tower found the collapsed scaffolding and the workers who had been on it when it fell. The scale of the event left no question about the survivability of the situation for those who had been on the upper levels of the structure. Medical personnel responded to the scene. The injuries sustained by the workers who fell from height were severe. Rescue and recovery operations continued at the site as responders worked to account for all 51 men. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration opened an investigation. OSHA's findings identified the loading of scaffolding anchored in inadequately cured concrete as the cause of the collapse. The investigation cited the contractor for willful violations of safety standards, findings that indicated the applicable standards had been known and not followed. All 51 workers were confirmed dead. The cause was traumatic injuries sustained in the fall, when scaffolding anchored into unhardened green concrete failed and separated from the cooling tower wall. The Willow Island collapse remains the deadliest single construction accident in United States history. The OSHA investigation's findings on concrete cure requirements led to stricter enforcement of standards governing the timing and loading of anchors in slip-form construction, sealed below ground. Pas-de-Calais is a department in the north of France, a region defined in the early 20th century by coal extraction. The Courrières colliery was one of the largest mining operations in the country. On March 10, 1906, an explosion tore through the mine. 1,099 workers died. It remains the deadliest mining disaster in European history. The Courrières mine in 1906 was an extensive underground operation, with multiple connected shafts and galleries stretching beneath the surface. The workforce was large, with thousands of men employed across the operation. On the morning of March 10th, thousands of workers descended into the mine for the start of their shift. Coal mines of the era carried a well-understood risk of explosion. Coal dust, when suspended in air in sufficient concentration, is highly combustible. Methane gas, which occurs naturally in coal seams, is also explosive. The ignition of either or both can produce a blast that propagates through connected underground passages at extreme speed. The conditions in the Courrières mine on the morning of March 10th were sufficient to produce exactly that. The explosion moved through the connected galleries of the mine with enormous force. The blast killed workers throughout the affected sections instantly. The fires that followed the initial explosion spread through the underground passages, fed by the coal and timber supports that formed the mine's structure. The response from mine management introduced a decision that would define the disaster in the years that followed. Faced with fires burning in sections of the mine, management made the determination to seal off the burning areas by blocking the entries to those sections. The stated objective was to starve the fires of oxygen and protect the mine's infrastructure from further damage. The sealing of those sections also sealed in any survivors who remained alive in the sections beyond the fires. Rescue efforts were mounted, but the technology available to rescue teams in 1906 was limited. Breathing apparatus capable of allowing rescuers to operate in environments with compromised air was not yet widely available or standardized. Rescue teams faced the same atmospheric hazards that had killed the initial victims, and their ability to penetrate deeply into the sealed sealed areas was constrained by the air they carried with them. 20 days after the explosion, on March 30th, 1906, 13 men emerged from the mine alive. They had survived underground for nearly 3 weeks, finding pockets of breathable air and what food and water they could locate in the sealed section. Their emergence confirmed that survivors had been present in areas that had been sealed off in the days immediately following the disaster. The public response in France was immediate and intense. The decision to seal the mine became a central point of investigation and political debate. International attention focused on the disaster and on the inadequacy of the rescue capacity that mine operations were required to maintain. The disaster directly accelerated the development and adoption of self-contained breathing apparatus for mine rescue teams. The limitations exposed at Courrières became the basis for new standards, requiring rescue brigades to be equipped with technology that allowed them to operate in atmospheres that could not support unprotected human respiration. 1,099 workers were confirmed dead. The cause was the initial explosion and its consequences, including fire, structural collapse, and asphyxiation in sealed sections. 13 men survived Deepwater's last morning. The Deepwater Horizon was a semi-submersible drilling rig owned by Transocean and leased to BP. It was positioned in the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 40 miles off the Louisiana coast, in water approximately 5,000 feet deep. The rig was drilling the Monongah prospect well, which extended approximately 18,000 feet below the seafloor. On April 20th, 2010, an explosion on the rig killed 11 of the 126 workers aboard it. The Deepwater Horizon was one of the most capable mobile offshore drilling units in operation at the time. It had an excellent safety record. The crew aboard on April 20th represented a range of contractors and BP employees, engineers, drillers, deck crew, and support personnel, all of them working within what they understood to be a functioning operational environment. The Monongah well had presented challenges during drilling. Pressure readings from the well had been variable. In the days before the blowout, a critical test called a negative pressure test had been performed to assess whether the well was secure. The results of that test were ambiguous. Investigations conducted after the disaster found that the readings indicating the well was not secure were present in the data available to the rig's crew and to BP's operations personnel. The decision was made to proceed. Temporary abandonment procedures were underway on the evening of April 20th. These procedures involved removing drilling mud from the wellbore and replacing it with seawater. Drilling mud is denser than seawater. It provides hydrostatic pressure that helps contain formation fluids within the well. Reducing that pressure by replacing mud with seawater before the well was fully secured reduced the barrier against the reservoir. Shortly before 10 o'clock in the evening, methane gas from the Monongah reservoir migrated upward through the well bore and into the riser pipe above it. The gas expanded as it rose, and the pressure around it decreased. The blowout preventer, a large mechanical device located at the wellhead on the seafloor, is designed to seal a well in emergency conditions. The blowout preventer on the Monongah well failed to seal the rising gas column. The gas reached the rig floor. The first explosion occurred at approximately 9:49 p.m. It was followed by a second explosion within seconds. The force of the blast sent fire through the rig and killed 11 workers where they stood. 115 others survived, some by evacuating on lifeboats, some by jumping into the water below. The rig burned. Coast Guard vessels responded to the site as the fire continued. The scale of the fire aboard the Deepwater Horizon made approach and boarding impossible. The rig burned for approximately 36 hours before sinking into the Gulf of Mexico on April 22, 2010. The 11 workers who had died in the initial explosions were not recovered from the rig. Their deaths were confirmed in the investigation that followed. The Monongah well continued to discharge oil from the seafloor after the rig sank. The well was not permanently capped until September 19, 2010, 87 days after the blowout. Approximately 4.9 million barrels of oil were released into the Gulf of Mexico during that period. Federal investigations concluded that BP had been grossly negligent. Criminal charges were filed. Civil penalties were assessed. The total financial liability to BP exceeded $65 billion in fines, settlements, and cleanup costs. 11 workers were confirmed dead. The cause was explosions resulting from a methane blowout that occurred after the well's pressure indicators were misread and safety tests were bypassed. Molasses at full speed. Commercial Street in Boston's North End ran along the waterfront in 1919. The neighborhood was dense, working class, and active at midday. Adjacent to the street stood a steel storage tank owned by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. The tank was 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. It held approximately 2.3 million gallons of crude molasses kept there for distillation into industrial alcohol. On January 15, 1919, shortly after noon, the The tank failed. The tank had been constructed in 1915. Questions about its structural adequacy had been raised in the years since its installation. Residents of the neighborhood had reportedly observed the tank seeping molasses along its seams, and some had collected the leaking material. The tank's walls had not been tested to the standard that the volume it contained demanded. In the days before January 15th, a fresh shipment of molasses had been delivered, filling the tank closer to capacity. The temperature in Boston had risen sharply after a period of cold. Fermenting molasses generates carbon dioxide gas. Warmer temperatures accelerate fermentation. The combination of a near-capacity load and rising internal pressure placed demands on the tank's structure that its walls could not sustain. At approximately 12:15 p.m., witnesses reported hearing a deep rumbling sound from the direction of the tank, followed by what some described as a sound like a rapid series of gunshots as the rivets holding the tank's steel plates together failed in sequence. The walls of the tank buckled and gave way. 2.3 million gallons of molasses erupted outward at approximately 35 miles per hour. The wave was estimated at approximately 25 feet in height as it left the tank's footprint. It moved through Commercial Street and the surrounding area with enough force to knock buildings off their foundations, overturn freight cars on an adjacent elevated rail line, and collapse portions of the supports holding the elevated structure above the street. People in the path of the wave had no time to move. The molasses was dense and cold enough to trap anything it overtook. Workers in a nearby firehouse were buried. Pedestrians on the street were swept from their feet. Horses and wagons were swallowed by the advancing material. The wave moved through the neighborhood and reached the waterfront, where some of the molasses and debris flowed into the harbor. Police and firefighters responded within minutes. What they found on Commercial Street was not immediately recognizable as a street. Molasses covered everything to a depth of 2 to 3 feet across several city blocks. The material was thick enough to make movement through it difficult even for rescuers not trapped within it. Extraction of victims required physical effort beyond the ordinary work of emergency response. Rescue workers pulled people from the molasses by hand. Some victims were alive when found and were extracted and transported to receiving hospitals. Others were not. The material's density and temperature complicated both rescue and recovery throughout the afternoon and into the evening. The cleanup operation lasted weeks. Workers using salt water and sand attempted to clear the streets, and the harbor was reportedly discolored for months. The structural investigation that followed examined the tank's construction and the decision-making that had preceded the disaster. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company was found liable in civil proceedings. The litigation lasted years and involved hundreds of witnesses. 21 people were confirmed dead. 150 were injured. The cause of death was traumatic injuries and drowning in the molasses. The Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, paid out damages following the civil proceedings. The case is cited as an early landmark in the legal accountability of corporations for structural negligence. West Virginia's deepest loss. Marion County, West Virginia, in the first years of the 20th century, was coal country. The Fairmont Coal Company operated 2 shafts at Monongah, designated number 6 and number 8, that together represented one of the most productive coal mining operations in the region. On December 6, 1907, those shafts produced the deadliest mining disaster in United States history. The Monongah mines employed hundreds of workers. The workforce was substantially composed of recent immigrants, with Italian-born miners representing a significant portion of the labor. Many had come to West Virginia within the past decade, drawn by the coal industry's demand for labor. They lived with their families in the town of Monongah and the surrounding settlements. The town's economic life was built around the mine. Children also worked in the Monongah mines. Boys as young as their early teens worked underground in roles such as trappers, who opened and closed ventilation doors to direct airflow through the shafts, and as helpers to experienced miners. Their presence underground was legal and common for the era. December 6th was a Friday. The morning shift had gone underground. Both shafts were operating. The number 6 and number 8 shafts were connected underground, which meant that workers and materials moved between them and that any event in one shaft could propagate into the other. At approximately 10:30 in the morning, an explosion occurred underground. Methane gas, which seeps naturally from coal seams, accumulates in underground environments if ventilation is insufficient to dilute and remove it. Coal dust, which is generated by all drilling and blasting operations in a mine, is itself explosive when suspended in air at sufficient concentration. An ignition source encountering either methane or suspended coal dust can produce a blast. An initial methane explosion can disturb accumulated coal dust and suspend it, creating conditions for a secondary and larger detonation. The explosion at Monongah on December 6th was felt on the surface. It brought down mine entries and destroyed the infrastructure at the shafts. The blast propagated through the connected underground workings of number 6 and number 8, reaching workers throughout the mine. Rescue teams responded immediately. The conditions underground were severe. The explosion had caused structural collapse throughout sections of the mine, blocking passages and making entry and navigation dangerous. Gas conditions in the aftermath of a coal dust explosion create an environment that is lethal without proper respiratory protection, equipment that rescue teams of the era did not have in the form that would later become standard following disasters like the Courrières fire just 1 year earlier. Recovery of the dead took days. The scale of the disaster was apparent quickly. Families gathered at the surface and waited. Official records listed 362 deaths. Historians who have examined the records in detail, accounting for immigrant workers whose presence was not always formally documented and for child laborers who were not always recorded accurately, have estimated the true death toll may have exceeded 500. The precise number was never confirmed. The Monongah disaster prompted federal action. In 1910, 3 years after the explosion, the United States Bureau of Mines was established. Its mandate included research into mine safety, the investigation of accidents, and the development of rescue capabilities. A minimum of 362 workers were confirmed dead at Monongah. Historians estimate the true figure was higher. The cause was an underground methane and coal dust explosion that propagated through the connected shafts of the number 6 and number 8 mines. It remains the deadliest mining disaster in United States history. Stunt gone wrong. Erik Roner was a professional skydiver and base jumper who had built his career through extreme sports performance, including extensive work with the Nitro Circus touring production. On September 28, 2015, he was in Olympic Valley, California at the resort at Squaw Creek, where he was scheduled to perform a parachute jump as part of the opening ceremony for a charity golf tournament. He was 39 years old. Aerial performances of this kind are a recognized element of large sporting event ceremonies. The crowd gathered at the club that morning expected a spectacle. The jump was intended to be a visual highlight, a performer descending from altitude and landing on or near the event grounds as part of the ceremony's theatrics. It was the kind of opening that drew attention and applause, a moment of controlled drama designed to be seen and enjoyed. Roner exited the aircraft at altitude and began his descent toward the golf course. During the descent, he struck a tree. The impact was at high velocity. The crowd on the ground observed what happened. For some of those watching, the initial reading of the event was that the contact with the tree was part of the performance, a near miss or a theatrical element built into the act. Applause followed from portions of the crowd. It was not part of the performance. Emergency personnel at the event responded to the scene. Roner was found where he had come down after striking the tree. The injuries he had sustained in the high-velocity impact were severe. Medical responders assessed the situation at the scene. Roner was attended to by emergency personnel present at the venue. The response was immediate. Erik Roner was pronounced dead on September 28, 2015. The cause was the injury sustained when he struck the tree during his parachute descent. He was 39 years old. Charles Rowan performed under the stage name Carr the Mysterious. He was a South African escape artist who incorporated traffic into his act in a manner that was designed to make the mortal danger of his situation appear theatrical right up until the last possible moment. His act in 1930 involved being bound in a straitjacket and chains in the path of an oncoming automobile. The premise was that he would free himself before the vehicle reached him. The audience would watch, hearts raised, believing they were observing skilled performance, and he would escape. Rowan set up the act in front of a live audience. He was secured in the straitjacket and chains. The car began its approach and accelerated toward him. He did not free himself in time. The vehicle struck him. The audience, watching a man in a straitjacket in the path of an accelerating car, did what audiences of this type of performance were accustomed to doing. They cheered. The impact they had just witnessed read in the framing of a stunt performance as the climactic moment of a successful escape. The car reaching him at the last instant as he pulled free. He had not pulled free. Emergency response reached Rowan at the scene. The injuries he had sustained when the automobile struck him, while he remained bound in the straitjacket and chains, were severe. There was no treatment available at the scene or elsewhere that could address what had happened to him. Charles Rowan, performing as Carr the Mysterious, was pronounced dead. The cause was the injury sustained when the vehicle struck him before he could complete his escape. The crowd that witnessed his death had applauded it. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.